So we've got the digestive process started. We have ingestion in the mouth. Um, we have a little bit of chemical digestion with the salivary amylase starting the digestion of starch in our mouth, mechanical digestion with our tongue and our teeth kind of breaking up the food. It's moved from the pharynx into the esophagus. The esophagus does not have a digestive function. It simply moves the food. It's just mechanically moving the food from our mouth to our stomach. So now we've gotten to the stomach, and the main function of the stomach is storing the food. Now we have some digestion going on in the stomach. The digestion of protein starts in the stomach, but I think there's a common misconception for people to think that most of our food is digested in our stomach. That is false. Mostly what our stomach is doing is it's getting the food ready for further digestion, and it's going to gradually release the food into the small intestine. The other thing about the stomach is we don't, because the food's not digested yet, the nutrients in our food are in our stomach. They're not moving into our blood at that point. But there is one exception that I like to mention. Alcohol is absorbed through the stomach. So the bolus that's coming down through the esophagus, it goes into the stomach. The nutrients and the food and the nutrients stay in the stomach unless you're alcohol. And alcohol can actually be absorbed through the walls of the stomach into the blood system. And I like to point that out because there's something that happens sometimes when you drink alcohol that you seem to feel the effects of the alcohol very quickly. And that's because alcohol is absorbed from the stomach right into the bloodstream. So it doesn't have to go through the entire digestive process in order to show the effects. So a little bit more about the stomach. The stomach's filled with stomach acid, which most of us are familiar with. And another name for that is gastric juice. And it has a pH around 2. And if you remember the pH scale, 7 was neutral. 2 is getting quite acidic. And so gastric juice is very acidic. I think we've all experienced some reflux, like when you vomit or you get a little acid reflux or you get that acid into the back of your throat. It's very acidic. It's not a pleasant thing to have in your mouth. So the stomach acid has this stuff called gastric juice. It has a low pH, and it also has there's also a lot of mucus involved in the stomach. In fact, the gastric juice could actually digest the walls of the stomach, except the stomach walls, I go back here, the walls of the stomach are actually covered with a lot of mucus. And the mucus prevents the stomach acid from digesting the stomach. And so as you swallow this food, it gets down into the stomach, it mixes with the stomach acid. And we call the mixture of food and gastric juice, we call that chyme. Chyme is a mixture of the food and the gastric juice. So remember, put food in your mouth, you form a ball called a bolus that goes down the esophagus. The bolus is delivered to the stomach. That gets mixed with gastric juice, and now it's called chyme. And you know about chyme because everybody's vomited. And that's what chyme looks like. You can see the food's been kind of mushed in with that stomach acid, and it's very watery. Meanwhile, that food in the stomach acid is going to be there. It's going to be there and be emptied into the small intestine in small pieces. It's not going to all go into the small intestine all at once. So it takes about 2 to 6 hours, depending on what you ate, for this food to get from your stomach completely into your small intestine. And so there's another one of those sphincter muscles. Let's go back and look at this. There's another sphincter muscle called the pyloric sphincter at the bottom part of the stomach, the inferior part of the stomach. Remember, we had the lower esophageal sphincter up here. Now we have the pyloric sphincter, another muscle that closes a tube, a round muscle. And that's going to let that chyme into the small intestine in just small units so it can be digested over time. And so the stomach is pretty much storing that chyme, that food that's being partially digested, until it can all be released into the small intestine. So, yeah, and so we said that gastric juice has that low pH. It does actually start, there's some enzymes that can start digesting proteins in that low pH environment. They're designed specifically for that. But again, most of the digestion of our food does not happen in the stomach. So let's talk about the small intestine. The small intestine is called small because of its diameter. And if you look at this, this is the whole gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, from the mouth to the esophagus to the stomach to the small intestine. Look how long that small intestine is. And then you get to the large intestine. Notice that the small intestine is narrow compared to the large intestine. So it's called small because it's narrow, but actually it's quite long, and it's much longer um, the than the large intestine. So 5.5 to 6 meters, that's about 15 feet long of small intestine, all crammed into our abdominal cavity there. You'll notice that the small intestine has three parts. You don't need to name those parts, but if you hear of them, be aware that they are parts of the small intestine. The first part's called the duodenum, the second part's called the jejunum, and the last part's called the ileum. And so food is going to move through the small intestine through peristalsis, through those rhythmic contractions. They're going to push these units of food from the stomach into the small intestine and move them through here. Now, the small intestine, I would say, is when you're talking about digestion, this is where digestion occurs. So get that out of your mind. Most digestion does not happen in the stomach. Most digestion happens in the small intestine. I put it right there. So there's lots of enzymes in the small intestine to digest proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. And these enzymes have names like proteases, amylase, and lipase. So lots of digestions going on in the small intestine. And then once we get get the food starting to be digested, then nutrients move from the small intestine. So the food's being broken down from like a starch down into glucose. And that glucose is going to move through the walls of the small intestine to the surrounding blood vessels. So the absorption of nutrients from the digestive tract into the blood system happen in the small intestine. So really important things are going on there. You'll notice like there's some pictures here that the inside of the small intestine looks like it's kind of wavy. And then if you look at it microscopically, there's waves of tissue on top of waves. And even the cells themselves have these little finger-like projections. The bigger folds in the wall of the small intestine are called villi, and these tiny little folds on the surface of every cell are called microvilli. And what these do is they increase the surface area of the inside wall of that small intestine. So if we're trying to move nutrients from the small intestine into the blood supply, you've got a lot more surface area for nutrients to pass. If this were just flat, we didn't have these villi, we'd have, we'd have the surface area of just that flat area interfacing between the inside of the intestine and the blood supply. But with all this surface area, we can put blood vessels all over the surface of this, and nutrients can be moving from the intestines into the blood supply a lot more effectively. So these villi, these finger-like projections on the inside of the small intestines, and the microvilli, the finger-like projections on the surface of cells, will increase the surface area of the intestines and help our intestines move nutrients from inside the intestines to the surrounding blood supply. I just wanted to show you a picture of that. So it says nutrients move from inside the small intestine into the bloodstream. So here's like a colored computer colorized picture of part of the small intestine, and it's just totally covered with all these blood vessels. Here's some bigger blood vessels and smaller ones branching off. So they're completely covered with blood vessels. So the nutrients from the intestines go into through the walls of the small intestine and into the blood supply. So the small intestine has two major functions. Most of the digestion occurs there, and most of the absorption of nutrients from our GI tract into our bloodstream occurs there. Small intestine is really, really important in digestion and absorption. And there I'm going to stop.